Thanks for joining us once again. As always, we are joined by Greg Engert, beer director for the Neighborhood Restaurant Group, a James Beard Award nominee. The group including Where We Are, Church Key, Downstairs, Birch and Barley. It's been toasty lately. What's on tap this week?
I probably didn't pick the best beer for the toasty humidity of Washington, D.C., but as with any great thing, when a beer is ready, it's released.
Yes, and you should drink it.
And then we're going to drink it, right? So, and not always seasonally appropriate, but nevertheless really amazing. This is one of the rarest beers, if not the rarest, that we've done on Beer of the Week for WTOP so far. Avery Brewing Company. It's called Uncle Jacob's Stout. And it is certainly not just a stout. It's actually a very strong imperial stout, 17% in climbing, alcohol by volume. And this is a super limited beer, 694 cases made. That's it. And what I love about this beer, many things. One is the story. So in an effort to get a little bit more background info on this beer, I actually just got off the phone with Adam Avery, who is the proprietor behind Avery Brewing Company and all the great beers they make. They've been around for 19 years. They're in the middle of a huge expansion right now, literally building a brand new facility, which is going to be fantastic. And it's cool because most everybody has an imperial stout aged in bourbon barrels nowadays. And most of the time, what people will do is they'll take an imperial stout they're already making and just see what happens when you age it in some bourbon barrels. Well, for Avery, the story is much more kind of complex and maybe even more interesting. Adam's sister is a huge genealogy buff, and apparently she discovered that 6 generations back, one of their great uncles is a guy named Jacob Spears, who was actually a bourbon maker in Kentucky. And in 1790, he was the first person, he's credited with being the first person to put bourbon on a label for a whiskey distilled in Bourbon County. And so and it's funny, he was telling me he was on the phone with her and she's telling him all this, and he's like, immediately he's like, I know what we're doing. We're going to make a beer, we're going to age it in the best bourbon barrels we can find, and we're going to call it Uncle Jacob's Stout. And so that's what they did. And rather than just take, say, the Czar, which is their really huge, humongous, really roasty, chocolatey, dry imperial stout, and just put that in barrels and call it Uncle Jacob's Stout, they decided instead to create a beer that would work best in the barrels. So then why is this important? Well, one thing I always say, people have asked me before, they're like, how do I choose which inevitably expensive barrel-aged stout to drink when there's so many out there now? I say that, one of the cool things is to look for, and this is not to say that an imperial stout that already exists that's aged in barrels is not as great as one that is created for the barrels, but it's really cool because when you craft a particular stout to age in bourbon barrels, you're going to take into account the way the bourbon barrels are going to affect the flavors. And one of the problems oftentimes for a fresh bourbon barrel aged imperial stout is that it's really dry because oak has tannins. The stout is roasty and really, really kind of bitter, somewhat astringent. So together, it can make things really, really too dry at first. You must need to lay those down and let them mellow out a little bit. So what they did here is they brewed an imperial stout of 17% that's actually on its own not as dry. They use some new kind of malts. Midnight Wheat is one. They use some just roasted barley to affect this kind of pitch black color without making it really, really astringent on its own, allowing the Maker's Mark bourbon barrels, that's what they use, it's aged 5 months in those barrels, to come in and provide the kind of tannic structure and the drying structure here. I think you'll also find a lot of great vanilla, coconut, Andy Parker's the barrel guy over at Avery. Described it. I think he described it as something like bourbon tinged creme brulee.
Well, I first think,
poetically,
nice warm fire. But I could do a chaise lounge swimming pool with this too.
Yeah, and that's the thing is that without the huge roasted effect, it's actually a little bit too sippable.
Oh, that's dynamite.
It's amazing, isn't it?
That's dynamite.
Woo! It's a little kick for an afternoon, too.
Now, Avery, and I think that's thirst quenching. That could work on a semi-warm day. Maybe not the 105 like last Saturday, but I'm pretty sure the first time I ever had Avery was at Rustico in Alexandria, before Church Key existed and where I first met you.
Yeah.
just dynamite.
I mean, the
beers.
thing that it's so great that you said that because I remember when I took over the beer program at Rustico right after we had opened the restaurant in 2006. Avery was definitely in the market, but it wasn't as plentiful as I felt it should be. It was always one of my favorite bottled IPAs, Avery IPA, from when I was over at the Brickskeller. Of course, they didn't have a lot of draft there. And so one of the first things I inquired about was how do we get Avery IPA on draft all the time. And I love it so much that we actually did it at Rustico Alexandria. It's still been pouring for years and years and years. Rustico Ballston, Avery IPA all the time. And of course, Birch and Barley and Church Key. It's one of my favorite IPAs in the country. And it really has that just beautiful, huge pineapple hit in the nose, which is delicious. Is singular. So,
what from the my stupid questions I'm not afraid to ask file? What leads to the high ABV in something like this? There's not alcohol being leached out of the bourbon barrels or anything.
A little bit, but not enough to take your typical 12% beer up
alone
there.
For the most part.
I think it's funny. I cannot speak to how Avery does it because I guess kind of naturally, it's one of the secrets of brewing. Dogfish Head's the same way. And I actually tried to ask the lead brewer from Avery via email how they did it, or how they were able to do it, and he was cagey and actually quite humorous about his answer. So I think there are ways that others have done it before. One is through freeze distillation. We hear like ice bock and things like that. Because when you freeze a beer, the water will freeze before the alcohol, and you can kind of remove some of those crystals and further concentrate the alcohol by volume. So that's one way some have done it. Another is to add champagne yeast, which is more viable in the presence of this much alcohol. But to the best of my knowledge, ale yeasts are incapable on their own of getting to 17% alcohol. So there's definitely some other method employed.
So now you mentioned creme brulee, but what would you pair this with? What could you pair this with?
Well, I mean, that was it was actually fun. I mean, that just makes so much sense to me. I would say, all manners of dessert. You're not going to really go too much earlier, I don't think, in the meal with this. I could also see just smoking a cigar with this would be just awesome as kind of a digestif. Yeah. But when you do think about dessert, though, there are a lot of people who are really into this, brownie sundae or something, and then a big chocolatey beer, which is delicious. Don't get me wrong. But I love to think about desserts like creme brulee that are more about the caramel, the bready, the kind of flavors that work with chocolate and espresso, but aren't just those. So rather than compounding it, so you could do even a cheesecake or something like that, something that's got a little bit of brightness balanced out by the darker intensity of this beer.
We have a question from our Ask Greg segment. We'll give you the email address in a moment to ask Greg a question if you have one. It comes from Alan, who lost power for 4 days last week. And I'm not sure exactly what type of beer he had in the refrigerator, but his question is, my beer's cold in the fridge, it warms back up for 4 days. If I refrigerate it again, what's going to happen to it?
Well, the thing is about that is that, first off, if you ever lose power, and we've had to deal with this at the restaurants before, if you ever lose power and you have beer in a refrigerated place that's no longer refrigerated, the best thing to do is to not open the door. You leave it closed because you will actually maintain, believe it or not, a lot of that, it's very well insulated. You will maintain the temp for much longer than you might think. So that's the first thing I do is just leave it there and try not to do anything to it, literally until the power comes back on. That way you won't affect as giant a change in temperature or something like that. The biggest thing, and I've talked about this before about hot, cold, is that really you can, like a cap beer like this, heat's going to expand and then cold will retract. So you can, over time, this could create a loss of grip and you can get some oxidation in the beer. So, if you have cans or something, not as much of a concern. And what I would say is that no matter what happens, once that power comes back on and once you re-refrigerate the beer, to try to drink it relatively soon thereafter, rather than allowing maybe some possible problems to further develop. But otherwise, I don't think you'd really have too much of a problem.
I'm not trying to knock the macros, but do the macros hold up better in that situation than say, a beer like this?
Well, it wouldn't be a knock. They're almost designed to hold up better because pasteurization will ensure that flavors can't develop any further. They might nullify some complexity, kind of give you a kind of just a neutral, stale kind of and be-all, end-all flavor in the beer once pasteurized. But pasteurization does kill off any possible microflora. So down the road, you don't have to worry about infection. I mean, the thing is about unpasteurized beers, which most craft beers are today, is that there may be some kind of nascent bacteria lying dormant, that if the heat gets really, really up there over time, it might be kind of woken, and then you could look at a possible infection. So the macros, you're not going to have to deal with that, but that's a sacrifice for flavor early on as well.
I was at an estate sale the other day, and there were some MGDs down in the basement from 1997. I took a pass on those.
Was it clear bottles back then?
Yes.
Well, that's an interesting thing, too, about why they're clear bottles, is that, UV light is a terror for beer, largely because the way it affects the oils from hops. So we can literally, transform those oils and give you that skunky character that we associate with some of the lighter bottle beers out there. And like Avery IPA, for instance, a beautifully hoppy beer. If you were to leave that out in the sun, or if it got light struck for too long, it's going to become pretty quickly skunky. So how is it then that a beer like MGD can be put into a clear bottle? Well, the reason is that they're using a kind of hop compound rather than just full-blown hops, so that they basically have arranged it so that they don't have to worry about that skunking happening.
Got a question for Greg. The email is beeroftheweek@WTOP.com. Greg, thank you as always.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Please always do drink responsibly, and be sure to bring your thirst next time for another Beer of the Week.